I'm Laura, and with me is Jeff. And welcome to our course, Introduction to Ethical Hacking. We have a series of modules that will teach you all about ethical hacking, rather, all that you need to manage. This is an introductory module, and in this module, we will be introducing you to various concepts on ethical hacking. We will be talking about vulnerabilities, exploits, defense strategy, penetration testing, and pen test types and methodology. We will also talk about vulnerability management, incident management, and security policy development.
Lots to talk about. Yeah,
Yes.
so this will be a really fun series of modules. You're going to hear the word hacking quite often, and you also, you've heard about ethical hacking among academic and IT departments, perhaps. Let me start with briefly explaining the terms hacking and ethical hacking. Now, in most cases, it's about posting unwanted contents on websites, stealing data, etc. The moment we hear about ethical hacking, it implies that there is something unethical in hacking, right? You can't have one without the other. So you need to understand these two types of hacking. Now, conceptually, both are the same, but it is the intent that makes all the difference. So let me first explain to you the difference between them. In fact, I'll let you start it out, Laura.
Okay, I'll get it going. Now, hacking is the skill of exploring various security breaches. There are many hackers around the world, but only a few are well known. It is important to know that not all hackers are identical. Each hacker may have different motives, techniques, and abilities. Though we don't appreciate what they do, it is important to know about them, what they do, and how they do it. And hackers are curious about knowing new things, brave about taking steps, and are often very sharp-minded. Hacking is an art as well as a skill, and most people associate hacking with breaking the law, so those who engage in hacking activities are considered to be criminals. And why do we say this? It's because their intent is bad. They cause damage, loss, and a whole lot of things.
So, yeah, excellent setup. So let's go back to the definitions. Ethical hacking is testing the resources for a good cause and for the betterment of technology. Technically, ethical hacking means penetration testing. It's focused on securing and protecting IT systems. So in essence, ethical hacking focuses on performing security analysis. So ethical hackers carry out their job in a planned manner, looking for vulnerabilities and analyze the security preparedness of an organization to face or deal with security attacks. So let me reiterate that unethical hackers are malicious in intent, and they are threats to an organization's information security. They could be a threat to society at large as well, by definition.
Correct, yeah. And hacking concentrates on exploits and vulnerabilities. Now, what then is a vulnerability and what is an exploit? A vulnerability is a weak link in the software, settings, etc., through which, if not fixed early, someone can get access to the computer, application, and/or network and can cause damage. It could be software related, operating system related, through a third-party package installed, or a flaw in the network. Exploit code is written to exploit the weak link.
Right, and an exploit could be a piece of software, or it could be a technology. It could even be data that can impact the computer. The point is, it's capable of making use of a vulnerability to gain unauthorized access to a network or a computer. It could then cause denial of service, steal sensitive information, or cause temporary or even permanent damage, right? So hackers look for vulnerabilities so that they can gain entry into the system. Now, if the exploit is a software, how big do you think that would be? It's very normally a very small piece of code or script. Now, this code or script scans the computer and tries to identify vulnerabilities. Now, most often, Laura, hackers get code from others and experienced hackers create their own code. So do you think programming skills are really necessary to be a hacker? Not really, not at all. You have plenty of software with exploits available on the net and in the gray market, and you can use them without much help. It's not that hard at all.
Exactly. Now, attacks on a machine are often carried out via an exploit, and an attack occurs when a system is compromised based on a vulnerability. Hackers or hacking uses exploits to cripple a system, steal info, etc. What does ethical hacking do? Ethical hacking uses a plan and a set of tools based on the plan to identify vulnerable spots in the operating systems, third-party software, application software, network configuration, etc.
Right.
The intent is to recommend steps on how to prevent a hacking attack. Now, we hope you got a basic understanding of an exploit, a vulnerability, and an attack. Let's learn some more terms.
All right, here we go. So the basic tenets of information system security are confidentiality, integrity, and availability, sometimes known as the CIA triad. Now, we will explain more about this triad a little later. So, Laura, let's talk about 3 more key terms often used in hacking circles. Now, 2 of them were introduced previously. We've talked a little bit about them already. They're exploits and vulnerabilities. The last one is what we call zero-day attacks.
Right. Now, let me talk about an exploit again and add some more details.
Great.
An exploit can cause a damage or change the behavior of a computer. Now, changing the behavior of the computer could be done by inserting malicious code or changing data or taking control of the computer or any combination of these. Now, the outcome could be total non-functioning to malfunctioning to anything that we may not easily conceive.
Right. So the big question really is, how do exploits get into contact with the target? How does it all start? The exploit could come from a remote location, which is possible by making use of vulnerabilities in the security. Sometimes the exploit gets accessed by some means and then starts escalating its privileges more than what obviously an administrator would normally grant for that role. Now, there are many cases where applications are hit by exploits. Sometimes users will be redirected to a malicious server, or social media will be used to gain access to applications.
That's correct. And some exploits are classified by the action taken against the vulnerable system. What do you think is the action? Now, actions include unauthorized data access, arbitrary code execution, and denial of service. Exploits find their way into the system and then work their way to gain super user access.
Super.
Yes.
Now, we should note that exploits have defined purposes. In general, they are malicious in intent. So as soon as an exploit gets published, people work to fix the issue related to the vulnerability itself. So once a patch with a fix is available, almost all users apply the patch, make the exploit obsolete, and at least in their context, in their own little world. So some hackers don't publish their exploits, at least not until they are identified and a patch has been made available. Exploits that have not been published are called zero-day exploits. Now, naive hackers, if there is such a thing, try hard to get their hands on such exploits instead of writing their own, and these hackers often called script kiddies.
Script kiddies, interesting. Yeah. Now, let me explain further about vulnerability. Vulnerabilities could potentially be 1 or 2 or all of the 3 elements of the CIA triad. To impact, there must be a vulnerability, a way for the attacker to gain access through the vulnerability, and the ability for the attacker to exploit after gaining access. To be able to exploit a weakness, the attacker must have a tool or technique to attack a specific vulnerability. Right. And this vulnerability is also known as attack surface.
Vulnerability management is a continuous practice, right? It involves scanning for vulnerabilities, classifying them, putting steps in to remediate them, and then working to mitigate the risk due to vulnerabilities. So a vulnerability can pose a risk to the organization, and the organization works to remediate and or mitigate it. Now, if there is a mechanism to exploit a vulnerability, it is called an exploitable vulnerability. Makes sense. What then is a window of vulnerability? Well, it's the time from identifying a vulnerability till a patch or a solution has been identified or the attacker has been neutralized, and often those windows are very small.
That's correct. An exploit that is not known is a zero-day exploit. An attack by an unknown exploit, it's called a zero-day attack. The issue could be there as the developers could not address it for some reason. It is called zero-day as the developers don't have time to fix the vulnerability before the attack. They have not had time to get it ready before the attack, so they literally have zero time. However, they can work on it once they are aware of the attack and release a patch. Once you have a patch, it is no longer a zero-day exploit. Yeah. It so happens that once people find a zero-day attack, they normally inform the product company or government so that prerequisite steps can be initiated to prevent cyber warfare.
Okay.
We briefly mentioned three terms, and we did this previously. Now, one is confidentiality, then availability, and integrity. Confidentiality is all about keeping access to the information only to the intended audience. Integrity is about maintaining the sanctity of information. Availability is about authorized personnel accessing the data at appointed times. These three together are known as the CIA triad. CIA triad is a model promoted to define and practice policies related to information security.
Yeah, and we're going to elaborate on each element of the triad, and we're going to start with the first one you mentioned, that's confidentiality. Confidentiality does two things. It ensures that the right people get the intended information, and it prevents sensitive information from reaching the wrong people. So data encryption is one of the most common means of ensuring confidentiality. Now, you know that SSL/TLS, a security protocol for communications over the internet, is being used in conjunction with a large number of internet protocols to ensure the security that we're talking about. Rigorous use of user IDs with security passwords is a standard practice, and in many places, two-factor authentication is mandatory. So you would have observed that biometrics are becoming popular these days, you know, people scanning their eyes, putting their fingers to things. Users are always advised to access data from secure places and avoid public sharing places to the minimum.
That's correct. And integrity is about keeping the data accurate through its life, whether it is in the same computer or shared or transmitted over the network. Data must neither be changed during the transit nor lost. It is essential that data is transmitted securely and necessary steps put in place. Now, we must establish procedures to identify any changes to data unintentionally. The data could be changed without human intervention, for example, by exploits, server crashes, accidents, etc. Backups are always maintained in a safe and secure place and made available on demand.
Availability, whole different ballgame, right? It involves a comprehensive planning of hardware, software, facility, people, and connectivity, just to name a few. Now, there must be a redundancy mechanism in place to fall back in case of failover. Now, this includes providing additional hardware, network bandwidth, facility, power backup, and, of course, taking measures to ensure a smooth transition to a failover site and back once the original site is restored.
Correct. Now, we just talked about the CIA triad. Let me take you back to hacking and timelines. A timeline is often termed as a vulnerability timeline, risks and the window of exposure.
Right, and on the timeline, we could see the discovery of a vulnerability, the exploitation of it, disclosure to others, and patches made available and installation of those patches. Now, from discovery all the way to disclosure, it is a black hat who uses the vulnerability. So from the time it is disclosed till the patch is available, normally gray hats use it. From the time the patch is available to installation of the patch, white hats use the vulnerability. So once the patch is installed, you are safe. There's a lot of hats there. Laura, you keeping up on that? So we're going to explain what these white, gray, and black hats are about, starting with, let's just say the white one first.
Okay, let's do that. Ethical hackers fall into the white hats category. They get permission from the data owner before any hacking and use their hacking skills for defensive purposes only.
Right.
They use their knowledge and skills to locate weaknesses and implement countermeasures, and for defense purposes and preventing losses. Then, what are the bad hats? Black hats are malicious hackers. Black hats, otherwise known as risks, try to hack systems with malicious intent.
Right, so you got the good and the bad. Now you're going to get what we call the gray. The third category is gray hats. Gray hats fall in between the white and the black hats. They are curious to know and use the tools and may not really be dangerous, but they're not white hats, and they can aid the company in informing them about any vulnerabilities they have found.
That's correct. And we have just talked about the vulnerability timeline and types of hats. We'll talk briefly about types of threats. They are classified into 3 categories: natural threats, technological threats, and human threats. What is a natural threat? It could be a flood causing areas to be waterlogged, or a hurricane or a tornado causing a lot of damage. Now, often these natural threats impact the availability of the systems. Now, we are more interested in technology threats.
Right, and they're less windy too.
Yes.
So let's talk about technology threats that could be caused by malware, zero-day attacks, exploits, or web attacks. We introduced zero-day attacks a moment ago and exploits to you, but what is malware? Here it is. Any type of program that is created with the intent to cause damage or steal data or abuse computer system resources, that's what we call malware. Now, these could be programs and files that are created to do harm. Malware includes computer viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. Any website may be compromised by cyber criminals and used to attack your data. So, here are 5 of the most common attack methods that continue to be the scourge of many websites. SQL injection, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, using components with known vulnerabilities, and what we call man-in-the-middle. Now, we're going to talk about these attack methods in subsequent chapters throughout this whole program.
Correct. Human threats are insiders who have authorization to access systems and hackers who use the exploits to attack. Social engineering is being used heavily these days to get the confidential information by tricking victims. Have you ever received any suspicious calls or emails asking for your bank account number, password, PIN, and any other information? I mean, the list of threats go on. And let's move on.
Okay, Laura, let's talk briefly about defense in depth, which is, I think, a very interesting topic. The principle of defense in depth is layered security mechanisms. The layered security enhances the security of the whole system, right? Now, during an attack, if one layer gets impacted, other layers can still hold down the fort, as we say, right? And implementing defense in depth strategy is not an easy mechanism. It is much more complex than what we normally would imagine. Now, implementing this approach could add to the complexity of the system, as I'm sure you're going to elaborate on.
Correct. So let me give you an example of what a layered security is not. Multiple implementations of the same basic security tool is not a layered approach. As an example, installing both ClamWin and AVG Free on the same MS Windows machine is not an example of layered security. This is a case of redundancy, not layering. The layering could be data, applications, host levels, internet networks, parameter levels, physical securities, etc. We will have policies and procedures covering these layers, and users may be made aware of these for sure.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. So on the data layer, you could have ACL and encryption. On the application layer, you could have antivirus and application hardening practices. At the host level, you can have OS hardening, your patch implementation, authentication, HIDs, etc., all those things. And at the internal network level, you can have network segments, IPsec, NIDs, etc. So at the perimeter level, you can have firewalls and VPN quarantining right on the edge. So at the physical level, you can have guards employed, the physical locks on, and tracking devices. So they're kind of how different things can work out in those layers.
Right. And defense in-depth strategies also include other security preparations other than the directly protective ones. They also address such concerns as monitoring, alerting, and emergency response, authorized personnel activity accounting, disaster recovery, criminal activity reporting, and forensic analysis.
Right. Now, having said all that, it is strongly recommended that you go for this approach. However, before doing this, make sure you have an assessment of your environment and decide on the defense strategy. Layered security is all about multiple types of security measures, layered, each protecting against a different vector for attack. Now, one of the most important factors in a well-planned defense in-depth strategy is taking advantage of threat delay. Now, by ensuring rapid notification and response when attacks and disasters are underway and delaying their effects, damage avoidance or mitigation that cannot be managed by purely technological measures can be enacted before the full effects of a threat are realized. Super important.
That's correct. This is a brief description of defense in depth. When we implement a multiple layered security, it increases an attacker's identification much more easily. Yeah. It also reduces an attacker's chance of success.
All right, Laura, now we are going to talk about penetration testing. A penetration test normally uses the same methods a hacker uses to gain unauthorized access to a network or system with a view to compromise them. The purpose of a penetration test is to test the security implementations and policy of an organization. The goal of this testing is to see if the organization has implemented security measures as specified in the security policy.
That's correct. And a hacker whose intent is to gain unauthorized access to an organization's network is different from a professional penetration tester. The professional tester does not have malicious intent and uses his or her skills to improve an organization's network security without causing a loss of service or disruption to the business. The only difference between true hacking and pen testing is permission. It is critical that a person performing a penetration test get written consent to perform the test.
And then when you get that consent, you can wear the white hat.
Correct.
So let's elaborate further on penetration testing. We're going to start with the types of penetration testing that are out there. External penetration testing is the conventional approach to penetration testing. This testing is focused on the server's infrastructure and underlying software pertaining to the actual target. It can be performed with no prior knowledge of the site or with full disclosure of the topology and the environment.
Mm-hmm. Now, internal testing makes use of similar methods as the external testing and is considered to be a more versatile view of the security. Testing will be performed from several network access points, including both logical and physical segments. It is important to note that penetration testing only gives a snapshot of the security posture of an organization at any given point in time. Internal testing will be performed from a number of network access points, representing each logical and physical segment.
Right. So, what do you get from this? Well, like you said, Laura, you get a snapshot. It is relevant at that point only. Now, any changes to your software, hardware, network composition, and configuration can necessitate a retest. Mm-hmm. Hope you got that point. Now, let's talk about black box testing. In black box testing, a pen tester carries out the test without having any prior knowledge of the target. In order to simulate real-world attacks and minimize false positives, pen testers can choose to undertake black hat testing or a zero-knowledge attack with no information or assistance from the client, and then map the network while enumerating services, shared file systems, and operating systems discreetly. Additionally, the pen tester can undertake war dialing to detect listening modems and war driving to discover vulnerable access points if it is legal and within the scope of the project.
Mm-hmm. In gray box penetration testing, the test is conducted with limited knowledge about infrastructure, defense mechanisms, and communication channels of the target on which the test is to be conducted. It is a simulation of those attacks that is performed by the insider or outsider with limited access or privileges. In this case, organizations would prefer to provide the pen testers with partial knowledge or information that hackers could find, such as a domain name server. This can save the organization time and expense. In gray box testing, pen testers may also interact with system and network administrators.
All right, so we talked about black box, we talked about gray box. It is now time to talk about white box testing. It's the other extreme of pen testing. In white box penetration testing, the test is conducted with full knowledge of infrastructure, defense mechanisms, and communication channels of the target on which the test is being conducted. Now, this test simulates the insider attacker who has full privileges, maybe somebody who works within the organization, unlimited access to that target system.
Yes. And we have explained about types of pen tests. We also explained about which type of tester corresponds to each type of pen test. Now, let me compare and contrast pen testing with hackers. A black hat test is done with little or no information about the system to be tested. A black hat hacker has a malicious intent and is not publicly known.
Otherwise known as the bad guys. Gray box testing is carried out by ethical hackers, and they are given some information about the system and network. A gray hat hacker is a skilled hacker who hacks a system, software, or network, but will not cause damage. He or she acts mostly for offensive purposes, sometimes in goodwill, and sometimes for defensive purposes. White hat testing is carried out with all the information about the target. Full disclosure, a white hat hacker always tests for a good purpose.
That's correct. Now let's compare and contrast hackers and penetration testers. A hacker will not have any code of ethics, whereas a penetration tester follows a strict code of ethics. A penetration tester has authorization before testing, whereas a hacker will attack stealthily and will not be known unless detected.
That's right. And a hacker will follow any technique or means to achieve his or her goals, right? A penetration tester confines himself or herself to a defined boundary. A hacker attempts to bypass the log so that the attacks can go unnoticed, and a penetration tester logs all activity. In fact, a penetration tester submits all logs and reports to the organization. There's analysis involved.
A hacker works to exploit the vulnerabilities, whereas a penetration tester tries to identify the vulnerabilities to get them fixed. Just to summarize, a hacker is a bad guy working for his own benefit, and a penetration tester is a good guy working for the benefit of the organization.
Right. So we have covered the basics of penetration testing and pen testers. Now it's time for a brief explanation of penetration testing methodology. The methodology has the following steps. You ready? Footprinting, scanning, enumeration, and penetration. We will explain each and every one of these.
All right. Footprinting is the process of creating a blueprint or a map of an organization's network and systems. Footprinting begins by determining the target system, application, or physical location of the target. Specific information about the organization is gathered using non-intrusive methods. The information the hacker is looking for during the footprinting phase is anything that gives clues as to the network architecture, server, application types where valuable data is stored.
Okay, whether you're trying to become a security professional, an ethical hacker, or a penetration tester, the same information or knowledge is required for all those jobs to be done well. Now, a lot of you already know the famous distribution of Linux, which was formerly called Backtrack. Backtrack has reached Backtrack 5, and now we have a new name and a new distribution for this box, which is called Kali Linux. Now, as we can see, it's very close to Backtrack. The same tools are still there, so if you're used to Backtrack and you like to keep that, that's fine. Or if you have your Linux machine and install the tools you require that you need for that machine, well, that's perfectly fine as well, whatever you need to work for you. Now, we do recommend beginners in the security field to use a machine like Kali or Backtrack because it has all the tools installed and is ready to be used. Now, you really don't need to mess with Linux and install all these tools to know which is best for use or which one you'll be more comfortable using. Kali and Backtrack have all the tools installed, and you can really start learning how to use them right away. So it's recommended that after you know your way on Linux, that you set up your own machine and install only the tools that you're going to need. Now, whether you are a pen tester or a security professional working for a company, it doesn't matter, it's the same Same set of rules. So when performing penetration testing, there are several steps to be performed and should be closely followed. You can't start by exploiting a system that you know nothing about. So depending on the pen test we are performing, whether it's white, gray, or black box, the information given to us is going to vary. Now imagine that we are performing a white box pen test. We already have most of the information, so maybe we can skip gathering information and actually get right to it and start scanning. But if we are performing a gray box or a black box pen test, we have to start by gathering the information. Can't scan what we don't have. So gathering the information about the target could be very easy or it could be very hard. Now we can start by browsing the internet for our target. We simply need a browser, and we can start by going to Google and Googling our target. Now we can use Google operators, which we will actually talk about in a different chapter, to find more information or specific information about our target. We can start by browsing our target. So we have gathered a bit of information, mainly what domains are used. We can then navigate to whois. Now I'm just quickly giving you examples of what to do. In the first step of penetration testing, what the hacker or the penetration tester needs to do is go to whois. We can use the whois online tools, or we can download an application which performs whois for us. Again, totally up to you. So gather all the information related to the IP and registration of our target domain. And we can go from there to find out more information, as we were saying, using Google operators to find out if there are documents with usernames or passwords forgotten somewhere, and we can get it from Google online. Now at this point we can also use some scanning probes, but I'd like to keep that for scanning at this point, touching the system or touching the target. Even if we are just performing a regular scan, we are now actually touching the target. We want to leave that at the scanning part. Reconnaissance, footprinting, and gathering information, it all means really the same thing, that you want to gather as much information as possible about your target, again, without anybody noticing you are doing so. That's the whole point. So you can also search for job sites. You can check here whether your target has published a job online, or if they require someone who has knowledge of Cisco Firewall or Juniper or whatever. So by now you know, seeing this job requirement, that your target has a specific or particular firewall system, and so on. So the information online is very rich. All the information you need, you will probably find online. Now if there is something left that you need to know, there are several ways to find it. And of course we will cover all of this in the chapter related to reconnaissance, so stay tuned for that.
Scanning is the next step. In a scan, we try to locate the systems that are live and responding on the network. Ethical hackers use scanning to identify target systems' IP addresses. Scanning is also used to determine whether a system is on the network and is it available. We can use scanning tools to find out IP addresses, types and versions of operating systems, applications and services are running on a computer, assuming they are opened to the outside world, or if the ports are opened to listen to. There are two types of scanning. One is port scanning and the other is scanning. Port scanning determines open ports and services. Network scanning identifies IP addresses on a given network or a subnet.
All right, the second step in penetration testing is network scanning. Now, many of you already know a lot of the tools used to perform network scanning, but there are a few of them that every security professional or penetration tester must know and master. So let's start a brief discussion of these tools. Now, if you navigate to Applications, go to Kali Linux and Top 10 Security Tools, we can find the first one here, Nmap. Now, if you are a Windows user, you have probably seen the Windows version or graphic version of Nmap, which is called ZenMap. It's probably the same, although here you have more control about the type of scan, how it performs the scan, and really what you need from the scan. Nmap can reveal the following things: the IP addresses of a different subnet, what the live IP addresses are, what the ports open for each IP addresses are, and whether the OS is running, what the virus is behind that IP address, and how long the operating system has been up and running. We can find out a lot of things here, obviously, with Nmap. Now, another interesting tool to know is hping, which is now on version 3. Type hping 3 and hit enter. You can see that hping 3 doesn't show the help menu right away. In hping and other applications, you can always type man, M-A-N, to get the complete manual on how to use hping 3. Now, another tool that you can use for scanning is Netcat. Netcat could be used as a Trojan or a backdoor, but it is also very powerful for scanning. So we have Netcat, we have hping 3, which is a scanning tool and an interceptor, and of course we have Nmap. Now remember that Nmap is only for scanning. It cannot be used as a backdoor or an interceptor. I ask every security professional to master these 3 tools because you will use them in your everyday work.
The next step is enumeration. In this step, we get detailed info about the target machine and environment. Here, we are getting into details for the final phase. We may have to connect to a target system to gather this info. Hackers follow a methodical approach to their hacking.
Okay, time for step 3. Step 3 is enumeration. In the enumeration technique, we will try to discover more information about a specific target system. So after scanning and defining which targets to attack or penetrate, we need to now identify some deep information. It's kind of like gathering information, but in an advanced way. So let's say that we are trying to enumerate an Active Directory server. We would try LDAP enumeration here. LDAP enumeration can give us user accounts, groups, computer accounts, Active Directory, and so on. Now, if we are trying to enumerate a particular Windows machine, not necessarily a joint or Active Directory domain, we can use IPC enumeration. This is done by using the command on CMD. If we are trying to enumerate a Linux machine, we can use RPC communication. We have RPC client that can help us do the enumeration on Linux. Now, besides that, let's take a look at how many applications we have for enumeration. Now, if you're not aware of the application names, you can simply go to Google, find out which application suits your target best. So let's go and navigate to information gathering, and we're going to check out a couple of these applications. If you go to DNS, we have an SNMP analysis. We have 161, which is a great tool to enumerate SNMP services. We also have DNS Enum, which I believe is going to be in DNS analysis. We also have DNS Reconnaissance. DNS Recon is a good application for enumerating DNS servers. For each of the services or the command services, there will be an enumerator. All right, so now let's go back to Active Directory at this point. We are targeting an Active Directory service, and we want to enumerate that service. We have a lot of tools that work on a Windows platform that are great to enumerate LDAP. Now, of course, there are applications that can be installed on your Linux machine that you can use to enumerate the LDAP service, although this is not something for the Windows platform. Okay, it's a standard that we can use on any platform we'd like. All right, now you can see here that all the enumeration applications fall under information gathering. So here's a question: why didn't we cover information gathering as step 1? Well, the answer is simple. It's because enumeration falls after the step of enumeration, or enumerating systems falls after scanning. So again, when you define your target of attack or the point of attack, you want to find more information which is specific to that exact operating system or device.
Once the basic and requisite info is gathered, next is to carry out penetration testing. Penetration testing is a method of evaluating security levels of a particular system or network. It helps you determine the flaws related to hardware and software. The early identification helps protect the network. If the vulnerabilities aren't identified early, they become an easy source for the attacker for the intrusion.
Okay, in step 4, which is exploiting or attacking a system, your attack will vary depending on what your target is. So let's say we have identified an Active Directory server to attack. That would definitely not be easy because Active Directory uses a security mechanism to encrypt the database. The hardening of a system is based on the knowledge of the IT administrator. So, let's say an Active Directory system is definitely using LDAP as a communication protocol. If our IT administrator has forgotten to secure the LDAP communication, well, it's going to be a pretty easy job for a hacker or a penetration tester to attack that system. But if the administrator has done his job completely, it's going to be a harder mission. So let's use something other than Active Directory. All right, so if we have defined a regular Windows computer belonging to any user as our attack target, we can then use different systems or techniques to actually attack that target. So let's check out what we have in the Kali Linux applications. We can start with the first attractive thing here, and that's password attack. We have many tools to use to attack a Windows machine. Of course, other machines are vulnerable to password attacks. We have all the tools necessary to perform offline or online attacks. GPU tools are faster and can give us faster results, but we'll need a bigger GPU on our system. So now, pretending that we have access to the network, we can start using sniffing and spoofing. Now, once you're on a network, sniffing and spoofing are very good attacks to perform. They give you great results. They can give you an enormous amount of data to work with to use for planning for your next attack, or maybe even your attack stops here. Now, actually stealing some amounts of data depends on what your plan in your penetration testing is. Now, if sniffing and spoofing are not enough for us, or password attack isn't an option, or it's enough but we want something more, we've got some other things we can do here. We can go, or we can move forward to exploiting the system. Now, check out exploitation tools. We have two giants in the exploitation. One of them is Metasploit. The other one isn't here, but it's called Core Impact. Core Impact is not released as a free tool or even a demo tool. It can only be purchased, and to be honest, it's very expensive. Metasploit has a free version that has already been installed in this distribution, so we can use it. We can plug this on Metasploit and see most of its capabilities right here. But of course, in the paid or commercial version, we will have more features to use Metasploit. Metasploit also has another version with a graphic interface for Windows users. If they like to use it on a Windows machine, they can still do that. Now, before using Metasploit or exploiting the system, you will need to make sure that you are using the correct exploit. This is really a big topic to discuss, but I'm going to try to make this brief. Basically, you're going to need to do some vulnerability analysis using the tools available here, or using a specific tool or the tool that you like. So maybe it's not here. So you will need to do some vulnerability assessment on your target system. Now, whether it's a database system or just another network server performing service, you will have to assess the system, discover what the vulnerable ports are, what the vulnerable services running on that system are, and then find the right exploit for the vulnerable service. Then at that point, try to attack that service. So everything comes in order. First, you may try spoofing the communication, the data transmit on the network. You may try to attack passwords to gain control of the system, or you may even try to find vulnerability for a particular system and then use an exploit to attack that vulnerability and maintain your access there. Now, with the exploitation, the system, and gaining access, the penetration test is complete. The only difference is that if an attacker is trying to exploit or hack a system, he still has another step to do, which is covering tracks or covering traces. Now, as a rule, hackers really don't want anyone to know that they were on your system or network, so they will try to cover every trace that will show that they were there doing this or that. So the final step in the hacking methodology is covering your tracks. The final step in penetration testing is when you exploit a system. You don't really need to delete the logs to cover your tracks because your client knows that you are trying to exploit or attack his system. He only cares about exploiting his system. So now, if your client definitely wants you to cover your attack to check out if he is vulnerable to these things, then he cannot really trace a hacker back, and that would be another step for you to perform.
We have just talked about penetration testing methodology and will now elaborate on it further, focusing more on the penetration testing part. When you try to penetrate into a system or network, if you are not successful, what would you do? Be happy.
There you go.
You're happy that you couldn't find any vulnerability. But don't stop there. Think like a hacker. Try to carry out a denial of service attack. If you are successful, you have a reason to alert your management.
It is possible to be in IT and be happy. If you are able to penetrate, what should you do? Well, try the following. You can try to elevate your privileges so that you can attempt to become a super user, administrator, root, etc. If you are successful, you have found a dangerous vulnerability. Good for you. Next, try to copy or alter data. Try to erase the audit trail of your activities. Log out without being noticed so that you can come back again. And if you are successful in doing these things, the purpose of penetration testing really is meaningfully fulfilled as you have unearthed some vulnerabilities, and that's success.
Yes, that is.
All right, so we hope you understand the penetration testing methodology. Let's now move on to attack vectors. Attack vectors are a way and means to hack into a target computer, obviously with malicious intent. They make use of known vulnerabilities to gain entry, and quite often humans are hoodwinked or tricked to gain entry. So viruses are always another way to enter into the system. They can carry payload. A worm does the same thing. For example, carries a virus as a payload. Trojan horses are a case of payloads. So are spyware, dialers, hijackers. The list really just keeps going on.
It goes on. Attack vectors can be classified into three major areas: network attacks, host OS attacks, and application attacks. Sniffing, ARP poisoning, MIT-M, spoofing, denial of service, and distributed denial of service are some of the network attacks. Malware, password attacks, DOS and DDoS, physical security, and privilege escalation are some of the host OS attacks. Authentication, authorization, session management, SQL injection, buffer overflow, audit logs, and DOS and DDoS are some of the application level attacks. You can learn about this in the subsequent modules.
All right, we have covered vulnerabilities, penetration testing, and have introduced the attack vectors. Now, how we can go about vulnerability management. How do we manage the whole thing? Vulnerability management is discovery of vulnerabilities and assessment of the risk to the network. It's a critical part of the business landscape for long-term success. I think many of you already know that mere patch management is ineffective and inefficient. We need more.
That's right. Vulnerability management involves the identification, classification, and potentially remediating and or mitigating of the same. Tools used for identifying and classifying known vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities scanners.
Scanners, right. And there are 6 steps of vulnerability management. There's discover and inventory assets, categorize and prioritize your assets. You need to scan for vulnerabilities. Then you report, classify, and rank your risks. Remediate, apply your patches, fixes, workarounds. And then 6, verify, rescan to confirm fixes and verify your security.
Now that you have a basic understanding of the vulnerability management, we will introduce the concept of incident management. Incidents are errors that interrupt or reduce the quality of the business processes. The incident management process helps to quickly resolve this incident with minimal impact on the business. An organization that implements the incident management process derives dual benefits for its IT services and business.
So what are the benefits of the incident management process for the IT services of an organization? Well, they're pretty clear. Improved monitoring allows performance against SLAs to be accurately measured. You get a more accurate recording of incidents and service requests. There's a noted elimination of lost or incorrect incidents and service requests. You end up with a more organized and efficient use of personnel for resolving incidents. One thing that's very important, you get greater availability of information of IT errors for effective management, and more accurate CMDB information for ongoing audits while registering incidents. And then improved user and customer satisfaction can't be overrated.
That's true. So what do you do when an incident has been identified? Security professionals say to go back to your security plan. As soon as an incident has been identified, invoke the incident and emergency response policy.
Right. All right. So let's go back to a previous question that we put out there. What will you do when an incident takes place? What are the next steps in handling that incident? Well, let me give a brief introduction to the incident management plan. Now, the steps involved in incident management plan are, and we've gone over them, but let's do it again: identify, analyze, gather evidence, contain further damage, work to mitigate, and work to eradicate the damage. Now, the last step in the plan is to update your policy.
That's correct. Here is a caution on incident management. Never ever take an incident lightly. It could be the tip of the iceberg. So consider the following. First, take a large attack surface into account. Second, include policies and action steps to minimize business disruption from incident. Third, provide adequate investigation, remediation, and a recovery. Very important.
Very important. All right, we have so far discussed many things, Laura. We've discussed vulnerabilities, penetration testing, incident management, among others. Now, do they work together, or are they all done in isolation? Well, they can all work together in the form of a security policy, and it is absolutely necessary to have a security policy in any organization. The security policy can also include the following. There's separation of duties, job rotation and mandatory vacation, least privilege, incident response, forensic tasks, ongoing security, training and awareness for users, and auditing requirements and frequency.
That's correct. Quite often, people think that enforcing IT security is the job of the security department. And do you think so? Well, they are the main drivers, but without the collaboration of other departments, the results will not be effective.
That's right.
Who are the collaborators then?
Good question, Laura. Collaborators include everybody, really. It's human resources, legal, management, clients and vendors, the people you work with every day, regulatory agencies, really anyone who you think can contribute, which should be anybody in your network.
Anybody in your network. Let me briefly introduce what should be included in a security policy and set up procedures. Identify key stakeholders. Define implementation. Identify the development method, develop a policies list, describe each policy, write procedures for each policy, identify updated triggers, review policy and procedures, and these are all necessary. So if you want to safeguard your organization from security attacks, make sure you implement them.
Good idea.